you. Yeah, it felt appropriate that I start and finish this conference. I will be giving the archaeological introduction and interpretation from this project, or at least some first results from this project. And Lisette will join me at some point to do the really complicated data explanation, right? Okay, so related to the chariots of fire, I don't think these are on. Oh, it is now. It wasn't on. Related to the chariots on fire project that Nico introduced yesterday, Lisette and Nico and I also have a related project in which we are going to generate a huge amount of data of both carbon dates and isotopic data on Middle Iron Age burials from the southern Netherlands. And this is a very interesting period in the southern Netherlands because I think at this point you've all heard about the early Iron Age in the Low Countries, but then we have this transition to the Middle Iron Age where we have a remarkably diverse burial practice in this area. We get inhumation alongside cremation. We get very high status graves with a lot of rich artifacts, but we also get them with less, and both the elite burials are both inhumation and cremation. So it gets very diverse and very complicated. And one of the questions we've, of course, always had is what influence does personal mobility and contacts with other regions in Europe have to do with this pattern, in particular because in the early Iron Age we have this connection more with the Hallstatt culture, but then in terms of materials in the Middle Iron Age we seem to have more of a connection with France and the Eisenmarne area. So just to introduce the sites that we are going to be presenting some data from, and I should say this is very much a first look at some results from this project, which actually appropriately the very start were funded in part by the winnings of the Déchelette Prize, I just realized. But our eventual, yeah, I had forgotten that until I actually started thinking about it just now. But our ultimate goal over the next 2 years will be to have 500 samples roughly analyzed from 300 individuals from 20 different sites in the southern Netherlands. So it's really going to be the production of bulk data, and then we're going to do a network analysis to see if we can find any patterns between the burial practice and the mobility as revealed by the isotopic research. So for today, because we have so much data and it's so complicated, we chose 4 sites to start with because they give some very interesting insights, but also raise a lot of questions that I think are of interest to everybody here. We are going to be looking at 3 sites near Os, known as the one with the Chieftain's Grave, nearby one with Zevenbergen, Os-IJsselstraat, and also Udesla-Broek. And just to give you some idea of what these sites are like archaeologically, Os-Voorstegraf, which is the Chieftain's Grave, and Os-Zevenbergen are 2 sites located very close together. They may originally have been one single ritual landscape, but unfortunately there's a highway in the middle, so we're not exactly sure how this originally connected. But both are very interesting sites in the sense that they have monumental Hallstattsee burial mounds amidst Middle Bronze Age barrows and early Iron Age flat graves. Now, the Chieftain's Grave itself, I think hopefully you remember from yesterday what that's about, but it was found in a cemetery that was originally founded in the Middle Bronze Age A. Then in the early Iron Age, we get flat graves and the actual Chieftain's Grave, whose urn was buried inside the Middle Bronze Age barrow, where they made a deliberate choice to the pit for the urn in the early Iron Age was dug off-center. So it's very clear that they were trying to connect with this ancestral barrow that was already 1,000 years old at the time, while respecting the deceased who was in it. And it appears that they may have intended to do something very similar at Os-Zevenbergen, where we again have a number of Middle Bronze Age barrows located on a line. I don't know if it's not working, is it? Over here. And then we have this one big massive barrow off to the side, Mound 3, which is a weird one in that it contained a burnt oaken plank, fragments of 4 objects, and a single piece of human cremated bone that Lisette remarkably was actually able to get a good sample from. Then the Mound 7, which is the other, also known as the other chieftain of Os, what they did here was they actually took what we now know to have been a natural round wind-blown dune located on this row of Middle Bronze Age barrows. They flattened the top, they created a pyre, they cremated another young man alongside richly decorated horse stack. Then they, after the cremation was completed, collected all the cremation, deposited part of the cremation remains in an urn, dug that into the pyre remains, and then covered it with a barrow. Now, of course, if you take, even though it was a natural dune, but it was a round-shaped dune on a row of barrows, our thinking is that they were actually trying to do the same thing as with the chieftain of Os, of creating this link with an ancestral barrow. Our third site is Udenslabroek, which we initially selected after we had done the isotope analysis of the chieftain's grave of Os and Ossevenbergen, because we were looking for what we considered quite a typical Urnfield cemetery to compare it with. So it's what we would, in the Netherlands at least, consider a typical Urnfield of lots of different barrows, flat graves, in this case also a single rich elite inhumation, but we don't have bones from her, so she will not be in the rest of this talk. And then in this case, the cemetery was also taken into use again in the Roman period. And lastly, a site that we have included in our data set, but the research was actually done by someone from the Crumble team, by Barbara Veselka. But it's an interesting contrast to our data because it is a Middle Iron Age cremation cemetery, including several graves with very rich torques. Yeah, so just sort of to summarize in terms of the archaeological contextualization that Lisette introduced, if we look at the Middle Bronze Age, where we unfortunately only have 3 graves because the bone material doesn't survive very well for these sites, I should say, we can see that out of 3 individuals, only 1 is really this massive outlier up here. So of these 3, 1 is clearly quite different than the other 2, which are much more in line with sort of the general distribution that we see in the Middle Iron Age. But again, it's a very small data set for this period. If we then go to the early Iron Age, we are really starting to get this idea that we are actually seeing an influx of people from elsewhere. It's reflected by the mobility, by the diversity also when we compare to the Middle Iron Age data set from Os-IJsselstraat. And that kind of fits with the idea that we've always had based on the archaeology of these people who after 1,000 years sort of take these old cemeteries back into use, and by not once but likely twice trying to connect the funerary monument of an early Iron Age chieftain or elite or whatever we want to call him with a ancient ancestral barrow. So in that sense, the isotope data seems to support the idea of an influx of first, second generation of immigrants into this area. Again, not saying how far away they came from, but very different at least. And fascinatingly, in terms of what we would distinguish archaeologically as elite and non-elite, which is a complicated issue as everybody here knows, in terms of the mobility data, there's no real difference. So that is quite fascinating. And then if we take Os-IJsselstraat, this Middle Iron Age site, which is, I think, less than 7 kilometers or 10 kilometers located from these early Iron Age graves, the pattern is completely different. We see striking mobility, very, very locally based, but in any case, their food is coming from somewhere completely different than the majority of the food reflected in our early Iron Age population. And it's not quite right there's no elites because we have 2 of the Torque graves, but unfortunately we haven't identified which one of these that is because it's not our data, and the old archaeological excavation information is proving difficult to connect the graves to the find numbers. But if we then, just because we did them anyway, compare what we have in these earlier periods to the early Roman cremation graves that we have at Slabroek, so again at a site also used during the early Iron Age period, we see a different mobility pattern compared to both Middle Iron Age, Os IJsselstraat, and the graves from the early Iron Age before that. So in that sense, this technique definitely offers you some insights into the relationship between archaeological data and the mobility patterns of ancient populations. So to sort of give you these first conclusions of what is going to be a much, much bigger project, we want to stress that sampling strategy is truly key, because this is something Lisette says often, is there seems to be this almost attitude amongst archaeologists, sort of the same as when we do radiocarbon dating. If you select a sample, you send it off, you get your data, and that's it. But it really requires a lot of thought out strategy, both on the part of the isotope sampler, the physical anthropologist, which she is too, very convenient, and the archaeologist for what questions you're trying to answer. And again, it also requires that same collaboration in order to get to any kind of useful and correct interpretation of the data generated. But I think it's clear that this collaboration should result in some really interesting approaches to studying ancient mobility patterns. So as for, are we really dealing with traveling bands of people in the early Iron Age and the Middle Iron Age? To be continued.